Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, you guys have been asking for me to take a look at Epic History's video on the Battle of Bunker Hill. They're doing an American Revolution series, with this being the 250th anniversary of the first year of the Revolution, which started in 1775, in April of 1775. We did take a look at Kings and Generals video on Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, which really kind of covers the first several months of the Revolution back in April on the anniversary, but we did not take a look at this one yet, and I wanted to give it some time. But everybody's been asking, so we're going to dive in today to the Battle of Bunker Hill. The link is in the description below, so you can check it out without my commentary. Also, check out my two podcasts, Stories of the Great War, Stories of the Civil War. New episode up for both of those today and tomorrow. Civil War today, Great War tomorrow. So check those out. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
April 1775. A British ship carries an urgent message across the Atlantic to the American colonies. Britain's Parliament has passed a Conciliatory Resolution, a last-ditch effort by Prime Minister Lord North to avert conflict with the colonies.
Yeah, and there's a lot of this that goes on, and eventually the British government's going to end up giving in to everything that originally was demanded, but by then it's too little too late. And notice it says Lord North is the one that is sending this. It's not coming from George III. George III is the head of state, but this is a constitutional monarchy at this point. Great Britain is led by Lord North, who's Prime Minister. And so as much as the focus gets put on the tyrant George III as the head of state, it's really Lord North's government.
Now that resolution is en route to America. It is a 6-week voyage. By the time it arrives, the shooting has started.
Yeah, and it's funny how this all works. 6 weeks is pretty fast at that point. It used to take a lot longer than that, and within another generation or two, you're going to have steamships that are going to be able to make the journey in less than 2 weeks. And then, by the time you get to post-American Civil War in the 1860s, less than 100 years from now, you're going to have a cable across the Atlantic where communication can happen in less than a day.
Lexington and Concord. Blood has been spilled. The war has begun. Lord North's Conciliatory Resolution is met with defiance in colonial assemblies and the Continental Congress. Its terms, which do not concede Parliament's right to tax the colonies, offer far too little, too late.
So let's take a look at this. Colonies must contribute to the cost of common defense. Remember, the whole point of contention here is that the 7 Years' War, which in North America is called the French and Indian War, was super expensive for the British government, and they want to see the colonies bear some of the cost of what they see as their own defense. Colonies must recover cost of royal government and administration. So in other words, contribute your fair share. And the colonists are paying far less in taxes than people in Great Britain are paying. But the contention, at least as it's stated, is not that they're paying taxes, but that they don't have a say in those taxes. In other words, they don't have representation in the government. Colonies may raise additional taxes subject to parliamentary approval. In other words, the colonies can do their own thing here if they want for their own expenses, but they've got to get approval from that. Parliament retains the power to impose taxes on commerce.
The reply from Congress, written by Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Richard Henry Lee, is a litany of unredressed grievances. And
these are really kind of the hardcore. I mean, obviously you've heard of these names, right? Richard Henry Lee is going to end up being the one who actually makes the motion to vote for independence in 1776. Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson are all on the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence. So see, these are some of the most extreme voices who are already thinking about independence, whereas a lot of people in Continental Congress at this point are still thinking about reconciliation.
The Coercive Acts, the Quebec Act, Vice Admiralty Courts, the list goes on. Negotiations are faltering, with fatal consequences. The fighting will continue, and is about to reach bloody new heights.
Yep. These fellows say we won't fight. By heaven, I hope I shall die upon my knees in blood. Joseph Warren. He's a doctor. A doctor. Love it.
June 1775. The main British force in America is in Boston, commanded by General Thomas Gage.
So why in Boston? Because that's where they saw this problem existing. In the British view, and largely it's true, this is a New England issue. The rest of the colonies are pretty well kind of just chilling and doing their own thing. It's New England that's the problem.
He has been reinforced to 6,000 regulars. But he is besieged by 15,000 New England militia. These men are highly motivated and have proven capable in combat, but they lack discipline and ammunition.
And this has largely happened spontaneously in the aftermath of Lexington and Concord, where the call goes out for militia, and these militia had been training, had been preparing, had been ready, and now they rise up and they just all flock toward Boston in pursuit of the British troops that had gone out to Lexington and Concord, and now they've surrounded, but they're all kind of their own entities, and there is some command and control structure in place, but there's no kind of overarching command, which is obviously why George Washington's going to come in around the time of Bunker Hill, just after.
Prior to the arrival of their new commander-in-chief, George Washington, they are under the command of Artemus Ward, a sickly 47-year-old militia officer of limited experience.
And see how much water there was around Boston, which was kind of on this little tiny, almost like an island. It's a peninsula in the middle. A lot of Boston today is reclaimed land. It's land that's been artificially manufactured where there was water 250 years ago.
Nevertheless, under his direction, the militia have fortified the heights overlooking the Charlestown Peninsula. From these positions, cannon could target British ships in Boston's inner harbour. General Gage decides he must eliminate this threat and decides to seize the heights as a step to breaking the siege. It will be an opportunity not only to avenge British honour, tarnished by the shambolic retreat from Concord. As General Burgoyne points out, it will also allay any doubt
that trained troops are invincible against any numbers or any position of undisciplined rabble.
And this is a lesson the British are going to learn the hard way, is that there's some truth to this mindset that a professional army can take on a rabble of undisciplined militia. And we see that time and time again on battlefields of the Revolution, that they're not really going to be able to stand toe-to-toe in equal numbers. But that doesn't mean that a disciplined professional army marching uphill into a fortified position is not going to take horrifying casualties no matter who it is they're marching against.
Gage orders Major General William Howe to make a frontal assault on Breed's Hill.
And this is the Howe who is soon going to be the commander of British forces in North America.
With 2,500 men. They are supported by naval ships, a floating battery of mortars, and cannon from Copp's Hill. But the attack does not go to plan.
And you see the fire that's going on in Charlestown at that time. That had a big effect on all of this because it obscured the vision, number one, of the commander back in Boston to be able to see what was going on, but it also obscures the vision of the supporting naval ships.
Protected behind fences and earthworks, the undisciplined rabble pours a devastating close-range fire into the British ranks.
It says close range. There's the often quoted line, I think it comes from Prescott, who was one of the American officers. It says, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." There's not any evidence, contemporary evidence at that time, that that was said by Prescott, but I'm sure orders to that effect were given, because that's the kind of order you would want to give to a militia, is that, you know, you're dealing with massed fire that is not particularly accurate at a long range. So the closer range you allow them to get, especially when you don't have unlimited ammunition, the more effective your fire is going to be.
General Howe orders a second attack. It meets the same bloody repulse. Hundreds of regulars fall. Some British units lose half their men or more. Spurred on by the leadership of John Stark, James Reed, and Joseph Warren, the Patriot militia are holding their ground.
Yeah, and one of the men who dies in one of these assaults for the British is the very man, Pitcairn, who was one of the officers in command at Lexington and Concord. Yes, I said Concord. Concord. I know how it's pronounced. And he's buried at Old North Church, the same church where they hung the lanterns for the Midnight Ride.
But they are running out of ammunition. The chain of command has broken down amid the chaos of battle. Hundreds of reinforcements mill about in confusion on Bunker Hill, while their comrades fight for their lives.
On Breed's Hill.
When Howe launches a third attack on Breed's Hill, the militia finally break in the face of British bayonets. The Redcoats' fury as they storm the redoubt is terrible. A British lieutenant is shocked by the slaughter.
I cannot pretend to describe the horror of the scene. It was streaming with blood and strewed with dead and dying men. The soldiers stabbing some and dashing out the brains of others was a sight too dreadful for me to dwell any longer on.
This was really one of the most vicious and bloody battles of the entire war, and it's the first real big battle of the war. Up until this point, you've really just had Lexington and Concord, which were kind of this running fight, and there were hundreds of casualties, but there was nothing like this. And honestly, with a few exceptions, you're not going to see anything on this scale to this degree of slaughter for the rest of the war.
The British take the heights, but are in no condition to follow up their success. In what becomes known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, they have lost 200 dead and more than 800 wounded. By contrast, Patriot casualties are around 450.
And most of those come at the very end in that last assault.
But include the charismatic Joseph Warren,
Yep.
president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress.
He was John Adams' personal physician. He was well-liked, and he was a young guy. I mean, it's so hard to grasp, but a lot of these guys are like in their 20s and 30s. And he's beaten and bayoneted and shot, and it's an ugly scene.
A commissioned officer who'd insisted on fighting as a private soldier.
Yep.
He was shot down in the redoubt during the final assault, becoming a martyr to the cause. For the Patriots, the battle, though a defeat, is a major morale boost.
Yep.
They have stood their ground against British Redcoats and tested them to the limit.
Yeah, and this is going to go far and wide to people. Hey, look at the casualties. We inflicted 1,000 casualties on the Redcoats. We took out, when you count the entire force in Boston, we took out like a sixth of their army. Of the men who were actually involved in this assault, it was a much higher percentage. Look at what we did. And there's 15,000 of us in Boston right now. Imagine what that many could do if we have an opportunity.
For the British, it is a lesson learned. The rebels' determination and fighting spirit must be taken seriously. As General Sir Henry Clinton remarks,
who will replace Howe as commander of as overall commander in North America for the British after Howe has been in command for a while.
A few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America.
Yep.
They
Pyrrhic
will
victory.
not make the same mistake again.
Many of our subjects in North America, misled by dangerous and ill-designing men, have at length proceeded to open an avowed rebellion. This is the very speech, or the very response to the Olive Branch Petition, as it's called, that it gets read in the TV show John Adams, and it's kind of the final straw for a lot of the guys who are on the fence about independence. But it's also the inspiration for, if you've seen Hamilton, You'll Be Back, where he says at the end, "I will kill your friends and family to remind you of my love." That's based on this proclamation.
That summer, British authority across the 13 colonies begins to disintegrate. The governors of North and South Carolina, Virginia, New York, and New Hampshire have all been forced to flee their homes. Others resign, while in Connecticut, John Trumbull...
You see Franklin there in New Jersey. That's Ben Franklin's son, who's the royal governor of New Jersey, on the opposite side from his dad.
sides with the Patriots.
I was born in Trumbull County, Ohio.
Only in
after
New
him.
Jersey and Georgia do British-appointed governors retain any control. The British have barely any troops in America outside of Boston, a fact which is underscored when frontiersman Ethan Allen leads a band of New Hampshire militia to storm Fort Ticonderoga.
And this is actually a great example of the issues with command and control that are happening when you have all these different militias from different colonies and things like that. Is that you have Ethan Allen heading up to Ticonderoga at the same time that you have Benedict Arnold heading to Ticonderoga. They're both kind of under different orders from different authorities, and they are going to fight over who's the one that has the say.
By a skeleton force of just 48 redcoats. The so-called Gibraltar of North America falls without a shot fired, and the rebels seize 59 heavy guns from its arsenal.
Which is huge. Huge. Even more huge is the fact that Henry Knox gets them to Boston.
Yet even now, there are those on both sides who seek a peaceful way out of the crisis.
Yep.
Moderates, like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, believe the colonies are too divided among themselves to survive without British protection.
And he's not wrong about that. And I think Dickinson's was a very pragmatic and understandable position. But I'll tell you this, John Dickinson, who all the way up until the moment independence was declared opposed independence, was one of the first guys to saddle up and join the militia to fight after the decision was made. Give him a lot of credit for that.
He foresees
a multitude of commonwealths, crimes, and calamities, centuries of mutual jealousies, hatreds, wars of devastation, till at last the exhausted provinces shall sink into slavery under the yoke of some fortunate conqueror.
some cling to a belief that King George III is sympathetic to their cause, but has been led astray by his dishonest and corrupt ministers.
And this is a mindset that goes back centuries. When you want to oppose the policies of the country without being seen as treasonous, what you do is say, I support the king. I'm a loyal subject of the king. It's his ministers who are leading him astray. They're to blame. You can go after the people that you feel are making the decisions. You can't attack the king directly.
In July, at Dickinson's urging, the Second Continental Congress sends a new petition,
The Olive Branch
to the
Petition.
king.
We solemnly assure your majesty that we most ardently desire the former harmony between Great Britain and these colonies may be restored. Your majesty's ministers persevering in their measures and proceeding to open hostilities for enforcing them, have compelled us to arm in our own defense.
And this is 3 weeks after Bunker Hill, right? 3 or 4 weeks. And so this is a good time to be sending this. We just inflicted massive casualties on the British Army. They're probably in no mood to continue seeing that kind of thing happen. Let's let the king know we want reconciliation. We want to work this out. And there were some in Continental Congress, like the John Adamses of the world, who were past that. They were like, forget that. I'm from Massachusetts. My doctor just got killed in this battle. I want no part of reconciliation. But at this point, they weren't there yet.
We therefore beseech your majesty to settle peace through every part of your dominions, with all humility, submitting to your majesty's wise consideration.
It becomes known as the Olive Branch Petition, but it is beaten to London by news and maimed British soldiers from Bunker Hill. In August, George III declares his American colonies to be in open rebellion.
Yep.
The British Empire begins to assemble its might to reclaim the colonies by force.
His Excellency George Washington has arrived amongst us. Universally admired, joy was visible on every countenance. General Nathanael Greene, who I think was the best American general of the war.
On the 2nd of July, 1775, General George Washington arrives outside Boston to take command of the newly christened Continental Army. Until recently, he'd been living a relatively quiet life as a Virginia plantation owner and local representative.
But he showed up to the Continental Congress in uniform. He had been a militia colonel during the French and Indian War, kind of started the French and Indian War in North America, and had tried to get a commission in the regular army like his brother had, but never got one, and had fought alongside some of these British generals that are going to be in command of the armies he faces later on. They had all fought together on Braddock's expedition.
But his military experience from the French and Indian War, serving as a lieutenant colonel of militia, exceeds that of nearly any other American-born officer.
That's true.
Through an advantageous marriage to Martha Custis, he is also one of the richest men in America, with a natural air of authority. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a congressional delegate from Pennsylvania, observes,
"He has so much martial dignity in his deportment that you would distinguish him to be a general and a soldier from among 10,000 people."
He was tall, he was like 6'2".
On arrival, Washington discovers the Continental Army to be in a deplorable state.
So Washington gets the command because John Adams is the one who makes the motion to name him commander of the Continental Army. First, they have to decide, are we going to do that? Are we going to have an overall commander? Is the Continental Congress going to adopt the militia as an army for all the colonies? They decide yes, and then he moves to make a Virginian the commander. So a guy from Massachusetts asking for a Virginian. This was brilliant maneuver. Not only was he a qualified candidate for the position, but naming him specifically is going to unite the colonies by bringing a Southerner into this.
Many soldiers lack proper muskets, and ammunition remains in critically short supply. There are few cannon, or even uniforms. Supply and logistics are in shambles. Discipline is virtually non-existent. The camp is a jumble of tents, ill-placed latrines, and unfinished earthworks. Officers fraternize with their men, who simply come and go as they please. Washington is aghast, but immediately gets to work. Officers are given sashes or cockades to distinguish them from their men. Severe punishments are introduced for desertion, fighting, and even swearing. Crucially, Washington orders his men be inoculated for smallpox, which has erupted across Massachusetts. This practice, also used by the British, may have saved his army from destruction.
And what they would do is they would literally like take a live smallpox, like sometimes they'd scrape it off of a person infected with smallpox and then put it right into an open wound on the person being inoculated. Sometimes they would use animal pox and things like that, but there's different ways it was done. And there was a chance you died from being inoculated, but there was a much higher chance you died if you didn't get inoculated. So it was like take a small risk and then be protected for life, or take your chances that if you get smallpox, now you have like a 1 in 3 chance of dying.
The Continental Congress has appointed several generals to serve under Washington's overall command, for a mix of practical, military, and political reasons. Some will win fame, others infamy, in the years ahead. Nathaniel Greene, a young Rhode Island Quaker who's educated himself in the art of war. He will become a close friend of Washington and his most able commander.
Fantastic general.
Charles Lee, an irascible and arrogant career soldier,
Terrible general.
disillusioned with the mother country. He is arguably the most experienced officer in the colonies, and Washington's second in command.
And he was also alongside those guys when they fought in Braddock's expedition during the 1750s. Not a good general at all. Thought he was.
Israel Putnam,
Pretty
a
good.
veteran soldier from Connecticut, nicknamed Old Put. He served with distinction in the French and Indian War, and more recently at Bunker Hill. John Sullivan, an
Also pretty
aggressive
good.
New Hampshire officer who had previously served in the Continental Congress. Horatio Gates,
Horrible.
another disillusioned British officer, capable.
Notice that Charles Lee and Horatio Gates are the guys with service in the British Army and who get disillusioned as British officers. And it's only a matter of time before they get disillusioned again. And they both try to take over from Washington. They both scheme a lot, both lousy. Horatio Gates is going to be given credit for the victory at Saratoga that really didn't belong to him. And he initially is given command of the Southern Army despite the fact that Washington wanted that command to go to Greene, who was very capable. Instead, they give it to Gates because of his political connections and influence. And he ends up getting his butt kicked at Camden, so much so that he flees from the battlefield dozens and dozens of miles, and that's the end of the war for him.
But privately contemptuous of Washington. These men and their officers must now pull together an unruly army summoned from across the colonies. From independent-minded New Englanders to equally stubborn riflemen from Virginia and Pennsylvania. Each man with more instinctive loyalty to his colony than to any shared cause.
Yeah.
However, Washington's greatest concern is a lack of gunpowder. By one estimate, there's enough for each man to fire just 9 rounds. This, together with the challenges of supply and discipline, means he can do little more than hold the fortifications around Boston.
Right. If you ever wonder why didn't, if they outnumber the British 3-1 and they've got them surrounded, why don't they attack? Well, this is one of the reasons: is supply, but also illness in the camps. Just the fact that most of these guys are militia and at any point could just go home. A lot of people that served in the American Revolution, the vast majority were militia. They weren't in the Continental Army, the regulars. And you'll see that, on their pension applications, that these guys will say, well, I served for 2 months in 1776 with this unit, and then in 1777 I served for 3 months with this other unit, and then in 1779 I served for 4 months in this unit. And that was kind of their service. They came and went. They didn't just join up in 1775 and fight through the end of the war. They came for a couple months, they went home. They came for a couple months, they went home.
Fortunately for the Continental Army, the British have problems of their own. Boston is riddled with smallpox. Most British soldiers have been inoculated or exposed to the disease, though some still fall sick. Bostonians themselves suffer much more greatly. Of greater concern, now they are bottled up in Boston, is that British supply lines now stretch more than 3,000 miles back across the Atlantic to Britain. British ships are now vulnerable to American privateers and the first vessels of a fledgling continental navy. The supply situation in Boston becomes critical, with starvation a growing fear. That the British find themselves in this predicament is widely blamed on General Gage's leadership.
He's out.
He is recalled to London, and command passes to General William Howe.
And Howe's cousin of the king, his brother, Richard Howe, is going to command the Navy. So a lot of influence, a lot of power there.
But under the present circumstances, there is little he can do to change British fortunes.
That man is not crushed before spring. He will become the most formidable enemy America has.
As the siege of Boston drags on, in Virginia, Governor Lord Dunmore holes up in Norfolk, under the protection of Royal Navy warships. From here, he comes up with a plan to crush the rebellion in Virginia. Across the southern colonies, roughly half the population are enslaved black men, women, and children.
I mean, look at that. South Carolina, it's more than the free white population. Georgia, it's roughly equal. It's not too far off in Virginia. South Carolina is where most of the imported slaves are going to come through the port of Charleston.
Most work on plantations, where they are treated with appalling brutality. As a result, the white population's greatest fear is a mass slave revolt.
So use that if you're the British.
In November 1775, Lord Dunmore attempts to turn this fear into reality.
I do require every person capable of bearing arms to resort to His Majesty's standard, or be looked upon as traitors. And I do hereby farther declare all indented servants, Negroes, or others, free.
He probably didn't have the authority to do this, but he's 3,000 miles and 6 weeks of communication, actually 12 weeks round-trip communication from the mother country. So he's going to kind of do what he wants.
That are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be.
God save the king.
It is a direct appeal to Virginia's slaves. Freedom for those who take up arms against their rebel masters. Nothing could be more incendiary. Few patriots consider the cause of liberty to extend to enslaved black Americans.
Convenient.
And in the South, Dunmore's proclamation threatens the destruction of the entire economy and society itself. Without irony, patriots condemn Dunmore's promise of freedom as a violation of all law, justice, and humanity.
Crazy.
To Washington, he is the arch traitor to the rights of humanity. Within a month, 300 escaped slaves have reached Dunmore's base in Norfolk, where they form the new Royal Ethiopian Regiment. Thousands more will seek freedom behind the British lines before the war is over.
And there's desire on the American side, on the Patriot side, to do things like this too. Very famously, you have John Lawrence, who will end up on Washington's staff, whose father was president of the Continental Congress and was captured by the British and ends up being held for a while at the Tower of London. John Lawrence wants to free and equip black soldiers in battalions of their own.
The price of Dunmore's proclamation is to turn southern landowners into mortal enemies of the British cause.
Backfired.
Norfolk is a loyalist stronghold, but unable to secure supplies for his forces, Dunmore decides to abandon it.
It's amazing in history how often this happens, where you think you're doing the right thing and what you end up doing is you cause a problem that wasn't even necessarily there. This is largely contained to New England at this point, the revolution, though it's got certainly its pockets of support in other places. But you've taken people who were on the fence, who maybe didn't care one way or the other or didn't support one way or the other, and you've turned them into enemies when they weren't before.
In the process, on New Year's Day 1776, Norfolk burns to the ground. Both sides blame the other. It is the largest, but not the last, settlement to be destroyed in the war.
I pity our good general who has a greater burden on his shoulders and more difficulties to struggle with than I think should fall to the share of so good a man.
That winter, the standoff continues at Boston, with conditions deteriorating for both sides. Life in the American camp is miserable.
We have suffered prodigiously for want of wood. Many regiments have been obliged to eat their provisions raw for want of firing to cook. And notwithstanding, we have burned up all the fences and cut down all the trees for a mile around the camp. Our suffering has been inconceivable.
The only good news comes at sea, where American privateers continue to intercept British ships carrying food and supplies. On the 29th of November, they score their biggest prize yet, the brig Nancy, carrying 2,000 muskets and ammunition.
Goes a long way.
But Washington faces another looming crisis. Most of his men have signed up to fight only until the end of 1775.
This is very similar to what you're going to see in the American Civil War, where everybody thinks that this is going to be a short-term thing. And so the enlistments are for a short period, thinking that'll be enough. Or because they figure they can't get people to do more. But now they're starting to realize this is going to take a while, and we're going to need people for a little bit longer.
And given the conditions, few plan to stay any longer.
Why would you?
December brings heavy snow and the expiry of the first enlistments. Despite the pleading, threats, and curses of their officers, almost half of Washington's men pack up and march for home. They take with them not only their muskets and equipment, but their hard-won experience. Washington is distraught. By January 1776, his force has been reduced to less than half its summer peak. There are now just 9,000 men under his command.
And that's a whole different ballgame when you're talking about laying siege to thousands of the British, and they've got more on the way, tens of thousands more soldiers on the way.
But General Howe's forces are not in much better shape. The British are even considering evacuating Boston.
For now.
Then, later that month, shocking news arrives in the American camp, carried in pamphlets and letters. King George III has addressed Parliament on the subject of America. From the King's own lips, the Patriots hear their cause condemned as a desperate conspiracy, whose ideas are repugnant to the true constitution of the colonies. He lays all blame for the conflict on the Americans.
There it is. That's the part that it gets read in John Adams. If you've seen that scene, when the unhappy and deluded multitude against whom this force will be directed shall become sensible of their error, I shall be ready to receive the misled with tenderness and mercy, and in order to prevent the inconveniences which may arise from the great distance of their situation, and to remove as soon as possible the calamities which they suffer, I shall give authority to certain persons upon the spot to grant general or particular pardons. And this is important because what you're going to see later, if you want to watch the details of this, I did a video on 1776, the year that America was born and nearly died. I'll put a link. I'll post a link down in the comment section, in the pinned comment for you on that, where basically you have this meeting that takes place between guys like John Adams and Ben Franklin and Lord Howe. And they're meeting to see if they can come to some arrangement outside of New York City where there's massive British forces landed. And Howe basically is there to just grant pardons for anybody who will stop fighting. And Adams and others get offended because they're like, we don't have anything we need to be pardoned for. We haven't done anything wrong. And so there's kind of this nowhere to go from there.
He lays all blame for the conflict on the Americans. He promises an overwhelming military response. In that moment, the Patriots' last lingering hopes of reconciliation die.
Yep. It's all about
Americans
independence
like
now.
General Nathaniel Greene, it's nothing short of betrayal.
Heaven hath decreed that tottering empire Britain to irretrievable ruin. And thanks to God, since Providence hath so determined, America must raise an empire of permanent duration.
So at this point, most of these guys are off the fence. It's no longer about reconciliation. It's about independence. And it's just a matter of getting everything in place and then declaring it.
Supported upon the grand pillars of truth, freedom, and religion, encouraged by the smiles of justice, and defended by her own patriotic sons.
For Washington, it's the final nail in the coffin of relations with Great Britain.
We are determined to shake off all connections with a state so unjust and unnatural. This I would tell them, not under covert, but in words as clear as the sun in its meridian brightness.
Until now, many patriots have shied away from calls for independence. But the mood has changed. The King's open hostility, the provocations of Lord Dunmore, the blood shed at Bunker Hill. Only a full break from Britain will answer.
Yep.
But Britain is preparing to fight back.
British Admiral Howe's got troops on the water. 32,000 troops in New York.
Do you enjoy
Harbor.
epic history?
Yeah, so again, I'm singing from Hamilton there, but that's what happens. They show up with 30,000 men in New York, and it was expected. And again, I cover this in the 1776 video, so if you want to kind of pick up the story here and see what happens next, check out my video on 1776. I cover everything that happens after this. So check out the podcasts. The links are in the description. New episodes today and tomorrow on the two podcasts. Thanks for watching.